Hello everybody, and welcome to Brewmasters, where we interview tabletop game designers to get their insights on the craft. This week we're talking to Yorviing, a friend to many in the Discord of Many Things, known for his creative world building, and currently working on a campaign setting called Ivara. Before we get to that though, this is your regular reminder to like and subscribe, and make a wisdom saving throw clicking on the bell icon on a failed save, so you get notifications whenever a new video comes out. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Hey man, it's great to have you on the show. I really appreciate you making the time for us.
Yeah, super excited. And thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. So let's see. Let's start with the same question I always start with everyone. How did you first get into tabletop role-playing games?
I got into it. Well, I was first introduced to the concept when I was younger. But I didn't necessarily start playing anything like that. Around the time I was 13, 14 or something like that, I was I used to be involved in an organization that I actually kind of want to go back to at some point, called SCA, which was the Society for Creative Anachronism. And it was basically people who did HEMA and a lot of stuff for Renaissance fairs, and they would do combative stuff with swordplay, spearmanship and stuff like that. And some of the older dudes, because I was the youngest guy by a huge margin, but I really was into it, and I was insanely into it. Some of the older guys, one of them had a son that also did it, and I would hang out with him a lot. And one day we were at his house, and his dad and all the older guys were playing I don't. It must have been 3.5. That's what I'm guessing. 3.5 or 4th edition. Some point. My guess is 3.5. And I was really interested in what they were doing, and kind of wanted to join in, but they were it's going to take way too long. It's way too complicated. Not for that. So that was the first time I was introduced to it, and I kind of started to find things that I really enjoyed, because RPG games, especially video games Fable and Oblivion and even Dragon Age 2. I was super into games like that. And so then when it was I didn't really start getting into it until my first semester of college. I kind of started to dabble with certain games. The first game I actually really kind of dabbled with was 3.5 a little bit, and Pathfinder. And then kind of waned a little bit from that. Didn't really have anybody to super play with, because I preferred in person. I hadn't really thought about online at that point. And then it wasn't until 2 or 3 years into college I really started to get into it, and found a lot of like-minded people, and people who actually had schedules that lined up. So
That's
I was that was really when I started to get into it. And of course started as a player first, and then moved on to be a DM. And then kind of have been on and off, mainly more DM over the past couple years than anything. But I do really enjoy the times I get to be a player.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And since then, I've kind of expanded. I mean, there's a lot of systems I actually really want to try out. I've been really wanting to try Burning Wheel. Been really kind of wanting to dip my nose into Pathfinder 2, or 2nd edition, I guess. But I haven't had that time yet.
It sounds like you came into the genre more through a direction of almost LARPing.
Yeah. I've always had an interest in fantasy and older times. When I still am to a good extent, but when I was really young, I was very much into history, and particularly the Crusades were something that I studied quite feverishly. And it came because I watched a lot of historical themed movies when I was a kid. There was a time period in my life where I pretty much just cycled between 5 movies, and it was basically Monty Python, The Holy Grail, Braveheart, which is really historically inaccurate, Kingdom of Heaven, and I'd watched that one King Arthur movie where Clive Owen, I think is his name. He was King Arthur. Yeah. I pretty much cycled between those films, and then occasionally would throw in Lonesome Dove in there, which surprisingly was the one film that my parents were okay with me watching, I guess, because it was like, oh, that'll keep them quiet for like 6 hours or something. But it was because of those types of films I got really into history and started to really read a bunch of fantasy books, and would read like I read almost every book that I could get my hands on with fantasy, particularly like of course I read Harry Potter, I read the Redwall book series, and I read like the what are they called? The Aragon, the Inheritance cycle. Yeah. I'd read a lot of fantasy stuff, and then I kind of started to read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and then really kind of spiraled from there. So I've always had an interest with it, but my introduction to fantasy-based tabletop RPGs and tabletop RPGs in general came from my interest and love in those particular like areas.
That makes total sense. And I find, like, with my friends at least, where the history nerds collide with fantasy, usually you end up with much richer settings as a result of it.
Yeah, I've always liked creating worlds and creating settings and creating things. And I mean, it's one of those things that like I don't think anybody ever just immediately comes up with like a brilliant setting. They might have a really good idea, but like of course it takes time and it takes work. The first like setting I ever did was when I was in 6th grade. We had to do some kind of project for a class where we had to write like 3 chapters of a book. Like if we were to write a book, what would the first 3 chapters be? And I took that as like way farther than I really should have. And I got like super invested. I was like, I want to make a fantasy book series. And it was called like The Haven Chronicles. And I drew a map and I got like really, really into it with like, these are the races that exist. And this is kind of what their government is. And if there was ever a movie, this is who this guy would be played by. And got really into it. But like looking back, it's like there was, I'm surprised at like what I was able to do. Although it's easy to kind of pinpoint, like when you first start to get into that stuff, a lot of the things you end up coming up with are kind of like picking and choosing the things that you like from other previous things. You know, I liked the, like for that, like I liked the general overall seriousness of Lord of the Rings. Like it's kind of permeated with a little bit of humor, but I mean like overall the tone is pretty serious. And then I liked a lot of historically accurate stuff in terms of like how things were fought, and I was always a huge fan of like hard magic systems too, as opposed to soft. So like I watched, you know, Avatar: Last Airbender has like a very specific way in which like basically those abilities work, and I've always liked that kind of realming, like, you know, kind of wrangling in of that logic. And I think those paired with like just liking a lot of darker movies and horror and stuff like that really kind of, I've grown over the years to really enjoy those darker things.
And just to clarify, for the audience and myself's sake, what is the difference between hard and soft magic systems?
Well, hard magic systems are basically a magic system that has very clear, definitive like rules and the ways in which it works, as opposed to a soft magic system where it's not really, like there might be some general types of rules, but it's a little bit more open to interpretation. Not everything is known about it. You can kind of explain some things away. Like an example of like a hard magic system would also be like Full Metal Alchemist, which of course it's, you know, it's called something different within the context of that, you know, anime. But it has very clear defined rules of like, these are the things that you can do. This is what you have to do with it. These are things that you can't do, et cetera, et cetera. Like everything, of course, like the law of equivalent exchange, and you can't really, you know, do human transmutation because it costs so much. Like you can't really put a price to it. Yeah, those are kinds of things. And then like you look at something like, for me, I'd call like the magic stuff in A Song of Ice and Fire pretty soft, because it's not really clear how it works or like what exactly causes it. Like there's some kind of theories that I've seen out there, but a lot of it is just kind of just explained away. There's not really...
Yeah, the author's given like a lot of leeway as to how they can employ it and what it can do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so having clear, definitive rules, I've always been a fan of, because it gives you a sense of grounding. Like, it really makes you feel like you can kind of understand the world a little bit better, especially when it's a world filled with magic, which is something that, doesn't really exist in that type of sense in our world. So it helps to kind of, get your bearings straight when you're integrated into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that it adds realism per se. It's more like verisimilitude, I think is the word. Like, it feels realistic because it's complicated.
Yeah, it feels more realistic for that reason, and it interests me a lot more whenever I see or read something like that, because then it's a matter of seeing, okay, well, what is it that magic can do versus what magic can't do, and seeing like, okay, well, within that context, what are the people doing with it? How is it used? What role does it play? And those are things that I try to keep very conscious of, like when I make my own stuff, especially like different settings. Like, what's the, because magic is such a very common thing in a lot of tabletop RPG systems, and some systems go about it, completely differently than others. But the context of how it works within like a setting is, generally speaking, a very important thing.
Well, I love the way the White Wolf system handles it in Mage, where you have like the base magic system and you can kind of choose your custom path within that, like throughout the different options, but ultimately the way that it manifests and functions is entirely up to you. Like, you might perceive your version of magic as being a science, another person might see it as a creative thing that they feel their way through, another person might visualize it as clocks and like timepieces they have to fix and construct, and it makes it so much more versatile in that sense creatively.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes it a lot more interesting to me, which is not to say that I don't enjoy soft magic, but if I was to do like a preference over the two, that's what I like, is having it be clear, this is what it can do, this is what it can't do. Because then I think soft magic, at least my critique of it is that, like, because it's so, generally speaking, undefined, it's easy to kind of do hand wavy, oh, it's just magic, and that's kind of the answer to it. Whereas when it's got a little bit more refinement to it, you can look at it and say, okay, this is what it can do, this is what it can't do. What clever ways can I go about doing something related to it?
Yeah, 100%. Like, is that,
yeah.
it's what you say there, that the creative ways, like, you can actually like make it part of the story and like subvert people's expectations with it and do so much more with it than potentially you can with the soft magic system, right?
Exactly. And it makes it much more interesting to me. And I think that you can do something like that within like the context of like, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Like, there's definitely ways in which you could do it. You can kind of, like, I know some people who've ran systems where it's like certain spells aren't allowed, or, spells of X level are kind of capped. And I kind of have hit and miss opinions about like how certain people approach it. But I mean, like, the intent behind it, like making it where, hey, in this specific setting, these things just don't apply. This type of person doesn't exist, or, people of this specific, class are not seen as often. And it makes it much more interesting to me when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like at the very surface level, like if you wanted to incorporate harder magic in your campaign, you would make everyone have to use components. Whereas if you were going more soft, you'd make everyone use the arcane foci.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And then expanding on what you were saying about like certain limitations, I think is it Dark Sun where they don't have wizards, they only have sorcerers?
There's Sorcerer Kings, from what I understand. Is my understanding of it. Like, arcane magic is seen as like this very deadly, defiling thing. That's kind of my only knowledge of Dark Sun. It's a setting I've found interesting, but I don't know if I would ever be able to like run a game in Dark Sun. But the system or the setting itself is very interesting because it's very post-apocalyptic and dark, and there's a lot of viciousness to it. In certain ways, it kind of reminds me of like the Fallout universe, like in the Wasteland, where there's just like, there's like people that are cannibals and stuff, and people that do really, really nasty, dangerous things. And to me, like settings that have that, if they do it very well, are things that I really enjoy. Like a setting that's not all just pristine and clean, and there's a lot of fantastical elements, like that kind of real gritty, harsh, dark edges to it are really fascinating to me. But I think that there's a point where it can be overdone, and absolutely, where something is just so insanely edgy that it just, I'm like, I can't do that. Yeah.
No, I totally understand that. Like, would you say you have a preference for more high magic or low magic settings? I think, like, my impression would be that since you're into history, it might more on the side of low magic.
It's a good question, because for me, like, especially with the setting guide that I'm developing, that I've been using this one setting for years, and it's been kind of growing and changing over the years as I've really kind of started to flesh it out. I enjoy it when there is a setting where people who can wield magic can do really fantastic things with it if they are very skilled with it, but they're harder to find, or they have they exist in certain contexts. Like one of the settings I really enjoy is Thetis from the Dragon Age series, where mages can do really powerful things and really creative, like intricate things with magic, but there's not that many of them, at least in the broad sense of like per capita population. And even a lot of the ones that do exist in the sense of, oh, I'm trapped in kind of like a circle where I have to live in this specific area and study magic under the watchful eyes of people who would fear me and the things that I could do. So, like for my own setting, magic can get very, very like complex, and you can have people who can cast very, very high level, potent, spells and perform incredible rituals and stuff. But they're very hard to find people that are that high or that have that kind of capability, because I tend to stay away a little bit from settings where like almost everybody can do magic, because then I think it loses a little bit of its uniqueness, or a little bit of like, oh, this is what makes this person stand out from another person. Like if everybody can kind of do something, it doesn't really make it interesting to me. That's kind of my approach to it. But yeah, my setting sounds, or my setting like has people who study magic, and there have been time periods where a lot more people throughout the setting's history have been able to wield magic, but in its current state, it's a little bit more. It's kind of softened a bit. Like you're going to have more people that can't cast it than people who can. But it's not to say that people aren't aware of its existence. Like people definitely know that magic exists, and these are the things that people can do with it for the most part, like in a very general, common sense.
So would you say, like, because it's an interesting way that people can approach magic in different ways for different campaigns. Like you see it sometimes as just being kind of something that it's a trade that someone does, or you see it being elevated to the point where it's like only kings and queens consort with the highest wizards and that kind of thing.
For my setting, I mean, like people can do, the people who can wield higher magic tend to be either people in power or people who are consulted by people in power quite often. It helps to establish a type of social status, like where you kind of fall within that society. And different places throughout my settings, there's different regions and different lands, they view magic very differently. from each other. Like in one land, you might have it where magic is, for the most part, you could study almost anything that you want to, so long as you don't harm somebody else, and you're free to study. There's no magic that's like forbidden to study. There's no magic that you're going to get kind of weird looks if you start to study that for. But then you might have another land where magic is, the people who can wield it are kind of more carefully watched. There are laws in place that say, like, you can't practice magic of a certain type because it's way too dangerous, or it's too corrupting of the nature. There's too much power that can go into it. So it really just kind of alters throughout the setting, because like I find that more believable to me, that there would be, I mean, it's kind of like in our own world. I mean, like, you might believe in one thing, go somewhere, and almost everybody, kind of thinks somewhat along those lines. Whereas you would go to someplace else, and people might think like, that's weird. I mean, not really a lot of people think like, you here, or dress like you, or act like you, or something like that. And so in my perspective, I view magic as kind of falling within that same category, at least to some extent, because different places are going to perceive, just like they would religions, or a person's appearance, perhaps, or the way somebody dresses, the way somebody speaks. They're going to perceive how somebody wields magic, what kind of magic they wield, in different lights in different places. And so, especially, at least in my setting, I mean, like, magic exists, and there are events that happen and magical creatures that exist that, a common person would definitely encounter, but they would have to call upon somebody who knows how to knows something about magic in order to kind of figure out, like, hey, is this something dangerous? Is this something we can use? And so it makes it so that, for the most part, people who can wield magic tend to be a little bit more valuable members to society, especially because so few people can wield it. Those who can tend to take up some type of role of importance, whether like they're a wise elder in some kind of village, or they form like a council that helps to govern the populace, or they sell out their services and skills as, kind of wanderers, or medics, or witch doctor kind of things, and mercenary work. I mean, a lot of that's kind of how the magic kind of exists within that setting.
And a heck of a lot of responsibility to be thrust upon you if you didn't even want
it. Yeah, exactly. And it makes for interesting kind of dynamic, especially if you are somebody who happens to just wield magic, and it's not really something you were, like, I think of, like, in my setting, like, sorcerers are, tend to be somebody that, like, doesn't necessarily ask for that power. A lot of them are just kind of born, or they're created by accident. And so that dynamic of, hey, you are actually able to wield magic, that both makes you very valuable, but it also makes you a threat. But at the same time, if it's something that you weren't really wanting, I find that those kinds of, like, given the context of a setting, and then giving the kind of person that's in that setting, especially like if you're a player character, or like a player trying to do that kind of character, that type of dynamic and that internal struggle of, like, well, there's these places that see me as a monster because of what I could do, and then there are other places that see me as this incredibly valuable person that, hey, we'd love to have you stay in our town. Please help us, do all of these things, protect us from forces that would seek to harm us. And having that struggle of whether or not you want to kind of follow through with it, saying like, oh, this is my life now, or somebody, or thinking like, oh, this isn't something I really want. I want to try to find a way to get rid of it. I want to, go back to any form of normal life when I can. Those, I think that it's one of the reasons as to why I think when a DM is going to run a game, it's very important to talk about the context of a setting with their players. Like, before people even make their characters, before dice is rolled for stats, I think it's important to establish, like, what kind of tones you're going to convey with this campaign. What are the themes? What are things that, might be a little bit out of the comfort zone for certain people? establish kind of hard rules and stuff like that, and then making a character that fits into the setting. Like I'm not a huge fan of players who come to a DM with an already established character, saying like, "Oh, hey, I have this character I want to play." I think that's fine to say like, "Oh, hey, I do have this character I want to play," but just because you have that character that you want to play doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily fit within the context of that setting. Like, for example, in my setting, Drow don't exist. There's no form of dark elves whatsoever. So if somebody were to come to me and say, "Oh, I have this Drow character," I'd be like, "Okay, well, if you want to play that exact character, it's just not going to work in this setting." And I think that's fine. I think that it's okay to have limits on what's allowed and what's not allowed in a specific setting, because it makes it more believable when there's a character that feels like they could come from that setting. And especially when you mix that with other players who build characters in the same way, you get like a very lively, immersive type of experience.
Yeah, it creates like a compromise of fantasies on both their end and yours, ideally with the intention of creating like an equilibrium in the middle.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think like definitely it's interesting how players can end up with these like, I've heard of characters that will exist between all of the games a player plays, for example. So like some people have this one person that they're interested in carrying from one setting to another, regardless of how they fit into it.
Yeah. And it's not to say that that can't be done, but it just has to be done carefully, at least in my experience.
Yeah, like concessions have to be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there has to be some degree of compromise.
Okay, so let's see. So we've gone through from history interest to low and high magic, hard and soft, magic's place in a setting, governing it. It'd be interesting to know like what kind of limitations you or changes you put onto the basic character options for your setting. What made you kind of choose those?
Yeah, well, I mean, like the things that I'm creating for my setting of Ivara, like the different player options, you mean?
Yeah, anything like new or that you've removed from the base character options, and yeah, I'm interested like why you would do that as well.
Well, it's a good question because I mean, different settings have different ways in which they go about things. For me, I mean, some of the classic, for example, like some of the classic races exist. You have your dragonborn, your dwarves, your elves, gnomes, halflings, humans, and tieflings, but they exist in different kinds of ways, and it might just be subtle that the changes. I mean, the changes between like how a dwarf is in my setting of Ivara versus like a dwarf in, I don't know, Forgotten Realms or Eberron or something like that. It might not be super, drastic of a change, whereas some might have a little bit more of a change than others. And so those types of races exist. And then my setting also has a lot of newer races that exist. Some of them are kind of takes on, certain kinds of classical races that exist. Like there's a race of tree folk. There's a race of minotaur-like people. There's a race of bear folk. And then there are some where I take a concept and turn it just a little bit. So like, for example, there's a race in my setting called Orcani, which are like orcs in certain ways, but they don't look as brutish. They're still strong, but they're actually more intelligent. They are not savage types of people. In fact, they're actually incredibly gifted in the ways of like technology, engineering, being able to create new types of machinery and tools. And their structures are, they don't build like little, wood and hide and, straw huts or whatever. They build like massive fortified type cities that are well organized and well structured. And so there's a lot of changes that I make to certain, races in that regard. And then there's a lot of newer races that don't really have, I guess, at least to my knowledge, any mainstream, I guess, kind of views. I mean, like I have a race of people in my setting called the Hail, which are basically like shadow koalas. they're these little short, furry, big-eared dudes that can, they're very good at stealth. They can wield some minor degrees of shadow magic. They can see in the dark. They have a very interesting kind of place within the setting too. And a lot of, if I were to describe my setting of Ivara and the guide that I'm designing for it, if I were to kind of describe the tone of the setting, it would be dark and occult. There's a lot of things that are inspired by things that I've studied with like my degrees at university, and a lot of things that I find like personal interest in. Like, for example, I have a very, very, very strong personal interest in alchemy, to the point where, like, I mean, my first and second knuckles on my fingers are all tattooed with alchemical symbols. Like, I have stuff like antimony and, potassium carbonate and magnesium, and silver and stuff. And so alchemy plays a very important role in the setting, especially in a lot more of a realistic, real-world sense, where a lot of the goals of alchemy are like the Philosopher's Stone, a universal solvent, that quest for immortality and being able to transform yourself as well as things outside of you. And so I take a lot of occult things that I like to study, a lot of alchemy and strange religions, or like gods that aren't necessarily always benevolent. I like to incorporate those into my setting and the different player options. So, like, for example, I have planned to do an alchemy domain cleric. I have recently released a wizard that was based on a real world kind of branch of occult studies called chaos magic, which was an approach that certain people had to magic, where it wasn't, like, a lot of it was based on will and thought and desire, but I didn't call it that because chaos magic in other settings is a little bit more like wild magic, and so I didn't want to have like some name confusion or something. But the things that are very esoteric and mysterious and things that don't really make a whole lot of sense or odd, those are things that really intrigue me, especially when I'm watching something where it's like, ooh, I want to know more about that. Like, for example, say what you will about like the new Star Wars trilogy, right? I have my own kind of opinions on it, but there's a scene where Rey goes down into kind of these caves and caverns and kind of encounters this kind of, I guess, mystical force-like thing where she sees like multiple copies of herself, and they stretch, on and on and on, and she's kind of interacting and moving and stuff. And those are the kinds of things that, like, when I encounter them in like a book, or I encounter them in a movie or a story or a show, like, those are the things that interest me. Like, oh, what is that? What's that weird, interesting thing that's not really talked about too much? Like, what exactly is that? How does it relate into the world? And so a lot of my setting is drawn upon my own things that I study, as well as the things that I find really interesting and mysterious. Like, oh, that's something that a lot of people don't know about. Well, what's its significance? Like, why is it not super well known? Like, what's its role? What does it do? And so a lot of the setting is based on that. It's a dark and grim and occult setting. Yeah.
So it sounds like the things that fuel your curiosity about history kind of get infused into the setting in a more literal way.
Yeah, a lot of so when I first started getting into like making homebrew content for D&D 5th edition, a lot of the stuff I was interested in was like things that I wanted to play myself. I actually cut my teeth making a crap ton of sorcerers that are all really bad. I look at a lot of the work I've done from like the beginning of this year and going back, like all the way up to the beginning of this year. I look at all of my work and be like, I would do it so much differently. Not necessarily, I would do it better, but I look back at those and say, like, I'm glad I did those, but I know now, like, more things now that I've kind of had more experience to grow, which I mean is like what you would do in any other kind of field or area. Like the more you study it, the more you interact with it, the more you realize, like, if you look back at something older you did, you know, hey, it's not something I would do now. And I think that shows. And I think, like, if a person who's making homebrew, regardless of like whatever it is they're making, if they can kind of look back and, you know, see like, oh, hey, on this older brew that I did, here's this thing that I just wouldn't have done differently, or I made that messed up, it was overpowered, it was underpowered, or whatever. If they can take that and learn from it, I think that's a valuable thing. And sometimes it's hard to do that, and sometimes you have to get feedback that's really harsh. I try not to engage in very harsh feedback. I try to at least be as constructive as I can. And of course, I falter sometimes. I'm not perfect in that regard. But like, I detest when somebody gives feedback on a brew and all they talk about is the negative aspect of it, or say things that aren't really helpful to the conversation. Like if somebody says like, oh, this is just overpowered, and that's all that say, that's not feedback at all. That's just a statement. Or if somebody, like one time I saw something, it was in the past month, like somebody on r/UA had straight up commented on somebody's post, like, this is garbage. And that's not constructive. That's not good feedback to give. And just because you give feedback harshly doesn't mean that it's any better than anybody else's. So when I try to give feedback on something and try to help somebody out, I usually try to think of like things that I do like about it. And sometimes it is hard. Like if I'm just not interested in the thematics of something, which happens quite often. But you know, some people will make really, really good content, and it just doesn't interest me. But it's not to say that it's not good. And so I think that for me, going into what I do now in terms of homebrew, I'm drawn a lot upon a lot of historical things, a lot of things that happen in our world. And I try to see, like, is there a way in which I can incorporate that into it? Because I like to kind of push a little bit of boundaries, but I don't like to go too far. Because I think that there is a point where it's like you can think of something or do something and it's just a little bit too far-fetched, a little bit harder to incorporate into a setting. Like, if there's nothing wrong with doing this, but I don't really like doing it. Like if somebody makes for example, an otherworldly patron for Wardlock that's like specifically with a very specific monster, like a Behir or a Beholder or something, and it's tied specifically to that, it's not to say that that's bad, but those are kind of, they may be harder to implement into a setting. Like what if you really want to play this, but your DM just doesn't have like Beholders for whatever reason, or doesn't have Behirs. And so what I like to do is try to make things that you can approach from multiple different angles, or something that can be, at least for the most part, incorporated into a setting without too much issue. Like for example, like I recently made a pain domain cleric, and instead of just doing it where it was all like torture and sadomasochism and just like, I'm gonna hurt you all the time, like I incorporated it to be like, well, it's also, I mean, there's two sides to pain. There's the pain that you experience, the pain that you feel that hurts you on a physical or emotional, spiritual level. And then there's the other side of that, like how you can overcome that pain. What is it that gets you through that and stuff? So you can open it up to multiple player concepts. And I think that really helps distinguish a brew from others, is like, how approachable is this particular option for people? Like, how many different ways can you do it? And if you can make something that a lot of people can look at, take, and implement in different ways while still maintaining like a sense of originality and uniqueness to it, I think that that's when you really strike gold. Because like doing stuff like balance and adjusting numbers and fixing grammar errors, like as much as I'd like them to be done ahead of time, I mean, they happen. But those things can be, if you can get the general concept down and then just kind of get some help with tweaking it, I think you're in a good spot with that. And it's really important to do that, especially in my case, because a lot of things that I make, especially recently and for this setting guide, is based on things from history that I really enjoy and try to think, okay, well, how can this is in this setting. I've used it before, but only in a DM sense, and I've just kind of like hand waved, it works because of this. And how can I actually make it like a player option? Like, what can I actually do with it? So like when I approached like chaos magic from my real world, I had to think of like, okay, these are different elements to chaos magic. There are people that try to hit like a specific heightened form of consciousness called a Gnostic state. And sigils are a very important part in regards to how a chaos magician approaches the concept of magic. And had to try to think of like ways in which I can incorporate them. And it's tricky because a lot of the stuff that makes sense to me is only making sense to me because I study it a lot. A lot of times I'll get feedback on something and it'll be for a concept that not a lot of people know about, which is not like to say like, oh, I know this better than you or whatever, but it's that it's like, it's interesting. And so that's a lot of it is historical based. And I like a lot of spiritual things too, especially, unusual occult or eclectic types of religions or like approaches to it, like aestheticism, like hermeticism is something that I'm really interested in, and so trying to find that common ground is there.
And yeah, it's interesting because I don't think enough people necessarily consider that their homebrew has to be adopted by a GM into some kind of a setting. So there is an element of designing brew in such a way that it can be versatile enough to fit anywhere, like regardless of how high or low magic it is, or if you've got like a hard or soft magic system. Like if you can substitute like the power source for that class easily, then it's going to be more versatile and more people are going to potentially pick it up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is not to say that you have to do that. But I've seen like some people before who will post something that's very specific to like a certain context or a certain setting. And without like certain degrees of knowledge, people might approach that in the ways in which they're familiar. And so like my goal is with a lot of the stuff that I'm trying to create, which is a process, I don't think any homebrewer can just make something in like a first draft and it be absolutely perfect. I don't believe that anybody like that exists. And if somebody says that they do that, I think they're full of it. I think that somebody, yeah, I think some people can have really good ideas and really good first drafts, right? That can be 100% true. But I mean, there's definitely going to be some tweaking, some changes, whether it's flavor text or tweaking a mechanic, or like if you use dice for a spell, it's like, maybe instead of D12s, maybe use D10s or something like that. Like there will be some degree of compromise with it. But it's not, if you make something that's very specific to like a setting or in a very specific game, if you're going to get some kind of degree of feedback with it, just provide some sort of context for it. Like these are the kinds of things. Like one of my favorite ways to approach like feedback for somebody is to try to understand like what the intent is behind what they're trying to write. Like what is it that you're trying to accomplish? What are the themes that you're trying to get across? Because sometimes I'll look at something and go like, okay, well maybe this feature doesn't work here, but what is it you're trying to get at? Like what is it you're trying to convey? Because maybe we can tweak it to make it work like that, or we can maybe think of something else that can convey that same thematic.
Yeah, I think like it's very difficult for most people to provide any meaningful feedback. I mean, obviously we need to try and get feedback on our brews, and there's plenty of people out there more than happy to say something, even if it hasn't got necessarily the substance that you need.
Yeah, it's tricky. It can be just as hard, if not harder, trying to find feedback than it is to actually make the thing that you're trying to get the feedback for. And a lot of the like me personally, I like getting feedback via like a voice call or like a voice chat, like in Discord or something, because I can hear somebody's tone when they're speaking. I can hear whether or not they're interested or they're just trying to come off mean or something like that. Whereas through text, and some people prefer this, and I think that's perfectly fine, but through text, sometimes, at least for me, because I'm able to go back and reread it, or, might read it just at a first glance, I might interpret it wrong. A lot of the times when I get feedback through text, unless it's like something, like, oh, this is great, like, it's not that I don't value it, but I automatically think it's always like a personal attack on me. Like if it's like negative, I always read it in a negative sense. And that's just a me thing. So, I mean, it also just kind of depends on what method you want to get feedback through and what it is you're trying to get. Because, yeah, there are people who will understand certain things better than others. But sometimes it's nice just to get at least some degree of constructive feedback. Like, oh, I like this. Maybe we can fix this part. I think just automatically going through and saying, like, these are the bad things, these are the things that are broken, and then not saying anything else, I think can really kind of put down somebody with it, at least to me. I mean, some people might like that really harsh criticism and only want to focus on that stuff. But for me, I like to hear, positives and negatives. Give me what is it that I'm doing good? What is it that I'm doing bad? And sometimes I, might fight back a little bit depending on what it is. But yeah, it can be tricky, especially because a lot of feedback, from what I understand, comes from Reddit, or it comes from Discord, and so it's really it can be really tricky. And the best advice I have for that is to just, like, if this is something that you're brewing, you really, really want to design it. First off, think of, like, what's the best way in which you can implement it. Because sometimes people will come up with a concept, and the concept itself might be really cool, but the way in which they're trying to go about it is maybe not the best method of doing it. Mm. Like, I couldn't tell you how many times over the past, 3 months, I was trying to struggle with how I wanted to approach alchemy in my setting, in terms of it as like a player option. Like, I already knew, like, oh, this is how it exists within the context of Ivara. This is, how common it is, blah, 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 blah. But I went from, like, having it be a full class to having it be a background to having it now be a subclass. And sometimes it's tricky, especially when you're trying to approach a concept from a very specific way. Like, for me, a lot of the stuff that I want to do with alchemy is based on real world alchemy, using like the 4 stages of transmutation, and using a lot of like the types of minerals like saltpeter and mercury and things that were actually used in alchemical studies, and trying to approach it like sort of like a divine science to some extent. So then it's a matter of like, okay, well, what's the best way I can approach that? And, some people are really good at finding a theme and being like, this is how I want to approach this. This is the thing that I want to do. Like, a lot of people, I think where I see that come up the most is people who tend to make like a lot of magical items. Like Griffmac, and I believe Loot Tavern is another one. Like, they make a lot of magical items that really help to convey really good concepts and really good thematics. And then there's some people who make like incredible like subclasses for a specific class, where they're able to, just by their knowledge of that specific class and how that class operates and plays, are able to make subclasses for it that just really are brilliant. Like, in just whether it's new thematics, new mechanics, something along those lines. Like, and it's fantastic when you see that. And there's certain people that I know that like tend to focus on certain classes. Like, I personally like to make a lot of wizards. I really, really enjoy the wizard class, and so I like to, generally speaking, wizards and kind of more recently clerics are the only things I ever feel in at least some degree of confidence in whenever I give feedback to somebody. There's certain things that like they might approach me for some particular help with it, and I will try to give what I can, but I don't really know a lot of the mechanics, or like I don't know the best way to implement them, and we'll try to recommend that they speak to somebody who's a little bit more of an expert with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like it's important that we as a community try to hone our feedback in such a way that we're always encouraging other people. Because the moment that you start like just shitting on other people's work, all you're doing at that point is gatekeeping, and that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't grow the community. Like there could be someone out there with like a really world-changing brew in their head somewhere that they haven't gotten to yet, and I'd hate to think that that person got discouraged from ever bringing it out.
Yeah. And I mean, I myself have been discouraged. There was like a point this year where I went on like a several month, like at least a month or month or two hiatus where I just didn't feel like brewing anything. Because I just felt really discouraged. Like I felt like a lot of the stuff that I was making was not interesting to people. It wasn't making me happy. It wasn't being received in. I wasn't getting the feedback that I kind of really needed, which wasn't to say that like, oh, like I want to make it clear that like I don't like, people who just kiss up to somebody with their be like, this is awesome, this is great, and like, but they say that every time. But I also don't like hearing just like this is garbage or this is trash, this is a terrible, concept. I don't know why would you ever do this? Like that's not good. Like you can have critiques and still be able to bring somebody up with it. And it could be really tricky, and I'm not perfect with that. I've said that before and I'll say it again. It's difficult to do that because sometimes you might get caught up in the heat of the moment. You might let your emotions really get the best of you when it comes to trying to give somebody feedback, especially if it's like for example, I've made a lot of wizards. Like I want to say I've made at least like 60 something wizards over the course of all of my homebrew like career. I wouldn't call it a career, but you kind of know like my homebrew path. And so wizards are one of the things that I will go out of my way to try to provide feedback on those because I feel like I understand that class enough to be able to at least provide somebody with some degree of constructive criticism with it. And sometimes I'll give my feedback and I'll get kind of a response that's not that makes it come off like, oh, you didn't praise my thing right away. I'm going to therefore like not really be super receptive. And that could be very difficult because like I've been there, especially when I was first brewing. Like I would make things and I'd be like, oh, this is a cool concept. And then I'd try to pitch it to somebody and be like, oh, this needs like so much work. And it could be really discouraging with it. And I think homebrew in that sense, it's kind of, I mean, I approach it now like how I do when I write music or when I paint is I try to think of what is the thing that I want to do? What is it that I want to convey within the medium that I'm trying to express? Whether it's like through the metal music I write or through the paintings that I make or through the homebrew that I design. Like what is it that I want to do? And what will make me happy with it? And then trying to keep in mind that when you get feedback, hey, you might not hear all praises. But if you can get feedback that's constructive and say like, hey, these are some things you're doing really well. These are some things that we can work on and tweak and get that kind of support. I think that that's really, really good to have. And that helps build a community because like I've had times where I've been part of like Discord servers and I don't really see that kind of, and I'm not saying like it's there all the time, but like there have been times where I feel like I'm just not getting the kind of experience that like I would like to get from it in terms of trying to be, getting a positive atmosphere, which is why I tend to stay away from conversation, like certain conversations specifically about like 5th edition homebrew, like Ranger rework discussions or sorcery rework discussions or why X spell is super bad or something like that, because like it's just they tend to be super repetitive and it's like the same things are said every time, and it just at some point I'm like, I get it, like yes, there are flaws in the system, but I don't like to hinder that or linger on that, I should say. And it's like, okay, well, if there is a problem and I really want to fix it, what's a way in which I can fix it? What's something that I can brew that gets like a certain thematic across that like I just can't really do as well with something that exists.
And yeah, I think it's an interesting point because I'm curious, like having started developing a campaign setting, how do you go about testing something that large?
It's a lot of work, and I'm lucky enough to be able to have play tested, different elements of this campaign setting guide over the past couple of years, and things have evolved. Like when it first started, it was kind of a setting that was, I don't know, a little bit bigger than what Barovia is when you run Curse of Strahd. And then over time it developed and just grew and grew and grew, and things changed and certain, elements changed. And I've run different kinds of stories and learned, over time, what are the types of themes that set it apart? What are the things that like I really like to focus and hone in on? And I'm fortunate enough to also be able to play test like 2 different campaigns at the moment that I'm going to be starting within. One starts 2 days from now, and another one will start within 2 weeks. To get to actually play test some of the player content, and also to play test some of the like adventures I'm going to write. And I have to keep in mind that when I'm approaching those, I'm paying close attention to the manner in which I'm running the games, paying attention to the stories that I'm trying to convey, and paying attention to the tone, and making sure that players are invested and players are interested in what I'm trying to do. And see also where, like, what are the things that players pick up on? Like, what are some things that, like, throughout a campaign, player 1 or 2 or 3 or whoever, says like, hey, I'm actually really interested in this. Like, can we find out more about it? And so learning that as I go really help. And my goal with this is to provide a setting that people can use that's not going to be difficult to use. Because like there are a lot of times where I will, and I bet there are people out there listening that maybe have felt the same thing, where they'll find a setting book or they'll hear about a setting, and sometimes they want to really get into it, but they don't know where to start, or it might seem really overwhelming. Like especially like if you're wanting to like DM that setting and run a game within that setting. Like for example, with me, Eberron is an incredibly interesting setting to me, but I don't have enough confidence in myself or enough knowledge of it to run a game within that system. Especially with systems that have, or not systems, but settings that have been around for quite some time, with so much pre-established lore and all of these things. Like there's that kind of fear with me that like, I don't know, like if for some reason I ever ran like a Forgotten Realms campaign, that I would have a player who knows a lot more than me and would make, not directly, but indirectly make me feel like I'm just not as knowledgeable. And it's like, well, maybe they should be the ones that are running the game. And so what I'm trying to accomplish with this setting guide is first off, I'm a big fan of when somebody makes something, I want it to be worth the amount of money that they pay towards it. Especially because I'm looking to get this book published with somebody who I've been talking to for almost about half a year now with trying to do that. And it looks like it's going good with that stuff too. But the point is that like I like making things worth it. Like I'm a very big bang for your buck kind of person. Like, $5 combos at a fast food restaurant, man, you got me, dude. Like, heck yeah. A drink, fries, meal. I got a dessert with it too. Heck yeah, dude. Like, I love that. And so I'm trying to approach my setting guide as being that way. I want it to be worthwhile and substantial, and for somebody to pick it up being like, wow, there's all this content, but also it's easy to kind of approach. And so first off, I mean, there's a lot of player options in my campaign book, which is, I think, more than any other campaign book or setting book that's been released. Where there are, of course, 14 new races. There are 3 universal sub-races. There's a new class. There are about 25 or so subclasses, and there are 14 backgrounds and a couple of, a multitude of spells. And so I wanted to make sure that it was a book worthwhile for both players and DMs. And designing it in such a way that's saying, hey, these are some things that you can do with the setting. This is the history of the setting. These are different elements that have happened, different events that are incorporated and have happened within the context of setting. But keeping in mind that you don't have to necessarily follow that, or you don't necessarily have to play one of the main story adventures. Because I'm writing a couple of different main storylines that you could kind of run. I guess in the same sense as you could a module to some degree. And a couple of smaller adventures, and then a section with how to build a campaign or a type of game within the context of the setting. These are different themes you can play with. What are the implications of players who choose X class or X race when they, play, or when you're kind of building your party together, and trying to make sure it's not overburdened with incredibly intense jargon, and making sure that there are clear guides. I'm going to include a pronunciation guide, and I'm also going to include an index and a terms section for the setting. That way there's easier things to approach. And another thing that I like doing is making sure that I try to keep everything within a certain page or something. One of my critiques of the player's handbook is that some of the, for example, when you get to the classes, you'll have part of a subclass on I don't know, the bottom right of a page, and you have to flip to go to the next page to read the rest of it, which is not a huge effort, right? It's just flipping a page. It's a real kind of first world complaint. But a lot of the things I'm designing are trying to be okay, this entire subclass is on this page with some art. That's it. I don't have to look at any other pages. It's kept right there. Or 2 pages. And if they're on 2 pages, then they're made in such a way that they're not going to be separated or weirdly positioned or shaped or something, and making it clean and clear and easy to kind of follow for both players and DMs. And that's the thing that I want to have people take away from it, is not that you have to abide by everything within the setting, but it's just a newer place for people to explore. Especially with the size of the setting, you could do an entire 1 through 20 campaign within one of the regions and never touch anything else. And that's fine. There's a lot to the world and a lot of things that are going on. It's a world where, there are gods that live among people and demigods. It's a world where there are intense battles and warfare going on between sides that it's really difficult to figure out who exactly is the bad guy, or even if there is one. There are crazy, weird, disturbing monsters that exist. There are witch covens that are trying to accomplish their own goals. There are arena pits that are, there for the challenge and for people to kind of make a name for themselves and a fortune through acts of violence and, gruesome kind of performances. There are vanished, ancient ruins of lands that are no longer populated. There are crazy curses that exist. There's a lot that's going on within the context of the setting, but you don't have to use it. A lot of the things that I'm writing are written in the sense of keep these in mind, but you don't have to necessarily abide by them. If you want to change it up so that in this, say I release the book and somebody's I actually want to include drow in it, then I'll have a section that kind of talks about ways in which you can incorporate other races without necessarily having to name them. But if you wanted to do this, you can do it this way. Because to me, I find that stuff very valuable. And so I want to kind of reciprocate that. I want to make a setting guide that's interesting, but is also very approachable for both a GM and player.
Yeah, I think accessibility is a really important part when it comes to a campaign setting as a brew. Obviously, there's so many possible campaign settings out there. It's difficult to incentivize people to come to yours and try it out. I think you mentioning the one-shot adventure set within the setting itself is actually a really good way to introduce new players to it and new GMs alike, kind of give them a contextualization of the universe.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because a lot of the main thing that I want to convey is to have the main thing that I like doing, because like I've been through those games where it's like, oh hey, you all meet at a tavern and you're all on this assignment. You got to meet yourself. You got to introduce yourself over the past couple sessions, and like those can be fine. But to me, I like kind of going into a campaign almost like in a media res sense, where like the player characters already know each other. There's a reason established as to why they're journeying together. And if that can be immersed in regards to the context of the world, then that's even better. And that's one of the things, like for example, with the Eberron book and Tasha's, when they introduced like the concept of group patrons, like that was like one of the better pieces for like both players and DMs that have come out in the past few years, in my experience. That was like, I just gravitated towards that because I was like, yes, this is fantastic. Like ways in which you can have all of your party bound together by a common goal without really having to kind of establish that through the first beginning of the game, which, like I said, that's not like a critique on that style. It's just not my style. And so the importance of the immersion in the world is the number one biggest thing that I want to convey with this setting guide, because it's a very different world. It has very specific kind of feels and themes going on, which again, you don't necessarily have to use all of them, or even, you can use only one of those things. But it's making sure that the characters that you run like a game for, that are, played by your players, feel like they are people within that world. It's a living, breathing world. And I can't tell you how excited I would be because like, a lot of the stuff at the beginning that I've written talks about like the history of the setting. And these are things that have happened in major events. Like this was the fall of the land of Satama. This was the era of the Old Witch War. This is the era of reclamation, like a bunch of different stuff. And then there's a part where it's like, okay, that's the history. What do you do? What do you pull from the history to run a game? How do you change it? Do you change up the world of Ivara to kind of fit your need? Or do you take established things and take them even further? What do you do with it? And I have written it in such a way that like you can incorporate different elements of the world into different stories. For example, the gods in that setting, the demigods, are not like some kind of off distant deity that's almost to the sense of a concept. Kind of like how in Elder Scrolls, like the Aedra are like these distant beings that you never really interact with in the same way that you do with Daedric princes. A lot of the gods are living, and they are actually mortals who have achieved such a high state of like existence and consciousness and like just spiritual like ascendance, like a transcendence of some sort, that they've become like gods. And in fact, there are several gods in my setting that are like that. And then you have to think like, oh, hey, how does that interact with the world? And what does that mean? Like if there are people who can become gods, can anybody become a god? What are the ways in which somebody can become a god? So that's one of the things like alchemy comes into play. It's like, well, if I can find a way to transform myself and transmute my consciousness into something that's higher so that what is on earth is reflected in the heavens, I might be able to achieve that. Or is it some kind of dark, forbidden magic that I have to make some pact with in order to become like this? It's a very common goal amongst people, especially those who can wield magic, to kind of achieve that stuff because it's been done before. And not only has it been done before, but you can go to places where those gods exist. They're walking, they're talking, they're communicating with people, that they govern over. And like you can incorporate one of those gods or demigods into your Ivara game. Or you can focus on like the different wars that are happening, or forgotten ruins, or this giant region, which is basically like medieval Dark Souls Russia, where it's this wild, crazy, cursed land with all sorts of stuff, and it's like an exploration kind of thing. I wanted it to make it so that you have a setting that you can run different kinds of games in, all within the context of a similar world, and them not feel too distant from each other. But also make it customizable so that, like, if you really wanted to include like a new race, think about like where they exist in the world. How do they interact with other races? If you wanted to introduce like certain classes, like in the setting as it is currently, firearms are starting to become, to some extent, a thing. Kind of like how the early primitive like weapons were starting to appear alongside cannons, like in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages. Like it's starting to kind of hit that realm. Do you take your Ivara game and actually put it in the future where rifles, are kind of evolved to flintlock, and it's a little bit more of like a 1700s vibe? Like you could totally do that. Or you can even have it where it goes to the point where, hey, it's actually like Victorian era time. These are things that you could do. And I've have it so that like I have notes on like if you wanted to kind of alter at what period of history you are in the setting. If you do it in the future, here are some tips on which you could do it. If you go to the past, here are some other things that you could do. I wanted to make it ultimately as flexible, as easy to approach, and as great of a setting as I can make for people. Because the people who have supported me over the years are incredible. And I feel like if I'm going to make something, I want it to be worth their while and then some. I want to make sure that I'm not ever delivering subpar content, which is why I focus so hard on trying to make sure that things look good, things are worded right, get as much feedback as I can. And getting that constructive feedback helps because then it makes me still feel motivated to do what I'm going to do.
And it sounds like you've made some extensive customization. Like, would you say you've gone so far as to create like a custom calendar or anything like that? Like,
yeah, there is a custom calendar. It's not a very complicated one because sometimes I've played in settings where the calendar is like a bizarre thing. Like it's like, oh, there's 667 days of the year, but there are only 3 months, and each month is like 200 and something. Like I didn't want to make it too complicated. But I've made my own calendar, like with the days and how long the days are. I've made like a sense of like, hey, there's a different celebrations. These are the games that are played. These celebrations. These are the different lands, and like, what's their government like? What do they import? What do they export? What's the population like? What are their social cues and views? Things of that nature. I've made sure to include in such a way that you can take that information and do with it what you will.
So it's kind of open-ended.
Yeah, it's very open-ended in the sense of you can take it and do what you want to. I think if I were to ever run like say like a Twitch game of my Ivara setting, I would maybe consider it like canon to some extent. But like, it doesn't mean that you have to follow that, obviously. You could do what you want to with it. I really wanted to provide a good, interesting setting that is not too outlandish to the point where you don't know what to do with it, but it's not so cookie cutter. There are a lot of races that exist and interesting things that happen, but it's not, overly complex. It's not kitchen sink. It's got a lot going on, but it has very clear, definitive things that has happened.
So based on your experience building the campaign setting so far, would you say that you've gone more of an approach of like already starting to play in this world early on and then kind of growing and building it as you play? Or did you take the approach of like just waiting until this thing is fully developed before you start testing and working within it?
Well, I've been playing with I've been running games in the setting for years. And it started with a solo game that I ran for my nephew, who plays a character that's going to be included as an NPC in the actual setting and plays a role with one of the major stories. And it was partially because like I found the story that we ended up running for him incredibly compelling and makes for a very interesting, believable character within the context of that setting. But also as like an homage to him being like the first player. But I've DM'd a lot of people in the setting, and with every game that I've ran with it, I've taken I've made sure to kind of take note of what interests players, what doesn't, what worked when I threw it at them, what really wasn't as up to the standard that I thought it was going to be. What are the different, key elements? And I think if you're developing a setting guide, play testing it and getting that, figured out as you go along is so much better than, like, say you just release the book and then start play testing. Because I don't think then that's going to be a very effective way. Because, like, I want to make it where when I release this book, it's like I can just use it, and there wouldn't really need to be like any kind of errata or, changes to it. And in fact, the only thing I have planned is, like, if there ever is a 6th edition, just adapting the book into that and maybe, expanding upon it and doing things from there. But like, it's a setting that I've grown and changed a lot over the years and have made it more definitive, because it took me actually getting to run the games to see what I liked about it, what I didn't like, things that, like, I maybe only included because a player was interested or something along those lines. And so it's definitely been a process, and I've had to get a lot of feedback for particularly the player options, which I focused on that and lore the most up front, especially because the player options require the most balance, the most upkeep. To making sure that they're not only thematically interesting, but they're applicable. You can make a lot of different characters with them, et cetera, et cetera. I've been focusing along that, which is an ongoing process. And so I've been kind of slowly releasing certain content over on Reddit about it to also see if other people would be interested in at least just play testing it, seeing what it's like and getting that kind of feedback with it, which I do get. I get people that have told me, like, hey, I played this, these are the things I liked about it, these are the things I didn't, and I appreciate that, especially because they're getting it from that firsthand perspective. And I've done that with other games I've ran, not even if it's necessarily homebrew, but it's like, how did this player approach the world, like, and how did they become immersed in it? Where are they from in the world? What is it that they do? And, like, how is it that they interact with other people, and seeing, like, oh, this is something that definitely can work, or these are some things we need to tweak. It's definitely a process.
Yeah, an extensive one as well, I imagine.
Yeah, it's pretty extensive. It's there's a lot to it that is important to kind of keep track of. And I've heard a lot of people say that they are going to do, like, a setting guide, things like that, and it's a lot of work that you have to put into it. But at the end of the day, you have to also really enjoy it. And I really enjoy the setting, because I think a lot of times when people create something, especially like in the fantasy or sci-fi genre or story, they want to kind of create the things that they want. They kind of almost wish were already existing, like, I kind of wish that this was a setting already and that I could just take from it and use it, because it's got a lot of things that I personally find very interesting. There's, like, strange deities, like there's a god that looks like a giant wolf with at least 20 to 30 wolf heads, like, going down its neck. There's another god that's just a giant stone, like a massive set of double stone doors. Then there's another god that has, or a demigod that has, like, 6 arms, and there are, like, weird occult things going on. Like, there are alchemists practicing things to try to become immortal. There are wizards who are dabbling in the art of, like, flesh magic. There are sorcerers who are born once a century that are able to receive, like, visions and thoughts from the gods in the sense of an oracle. There are witches that exist and have ruled over parts of the land before being persecuted and hunted, and now exist in, like, weird states throughout the world. So it's a lot of things that I find interesting, but it's just because I find it interesting doesn't mean that, like, when I write it, it's going to be good right off the bat. I have to also see what are the ways in which I can implement the things I'm interested in such a way that players would respond to it. What are the things they pick up on? What are the things that they don't like? Those are really important to keep in mind when you're developing something.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely feels like building a campaign setting is kind of one of the final touchstones on, like, the path of Brew. Like, if you imagine like starting out, most people will probably end up creating like these very small spells or magic items and then kind of build up to monsters and then subclasses and races and full classes eventually to campaign settings if you last long enough. And then I expect the next step after that is just creating your own game system.
Yeah, that's the next step in the evolutionary chart. You make an item, then you make a subclass, then you make a full class, then you make a home campaign setting. Yeah, and then you get to tabletop RPG design, which is a whole other kind of can of worms. In a very, I would say that's even arguably more difficult than making a campaign guide, because at least with that, you can refer to established rules. You don't have to come up with like new ways of doing like rule sets or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot that's involved with the process, but I'm fortunate enough to be surrounded by people that, you know, like what I do, but they don't like suck up to me. They'll tell me like, hey, these are things that we could, I like this concept, we could do it better. Or maybe this is like not portraying that thematic super well. Like people who give me genuine good feedback that's honest without being harsh and support me with what I do. And I think that that's really important, to have friends who can not only provide to you good, honest feedback, but do so in a way that doesn't put you down, which can be tricky when you go to get like feedback, say on the Discord of Many Things, and you put that out. There's that fear that like if you don't know a lot of the people there, you know, you might take their feedback in a different way potentially because it's all through like text or something. But if you get to know somebody, they can kind of help you out with it. And it's a very fun, if stressful, process. And there's a lot that goes into it. And it's incredibly fun. And I think it really just, because like I spent all of last year making my big wizard project, YAG, or Yorviing's Arcane Grimoire. And after that, I was like, well, I want to kind of step up. I want to do something better. Like I'm always trying to find ways in which I can improve and make things, you know, more useful. And I look back at YAG and I don't recommend it to anybody. I think there are good ideas in certain places, but I don't recommend the book as a whole to anybody. In fact, I'm pulling certain things from that to put into this new guide. And then eventually we'll probably go back and do a much more polished and refined version of that project. But I felt like that was the next step for me, was, okay, I'm actually just going to do like a campaign setting guide. And immediately after YAG was released, like, you know, I got a lot of positive feedback, and there have been people who've used it and stuff, even though I don't recommend it anymore. But I kind of did like some own, like I was like, oh, you know, I want to just take it slow, maybe do like some weekly brews and things like that. And then I found myself like not really feeling as motivated. And I think that's what led me to have a period where I was like, I'm going to take a break, because like I just didn't feel like I think I'm a person who needs some type of general overall structure in order for me to feel like I'm accomplishing and doing something, which is why I like school so much, especially like, you know, with degrees that I'm trying, you know, that I've gotten, and the ones that I'm trying to get, where it's like I like that sense of like there's this overarching theme, and these are the things that you're working towards because you're doing it for this specific reason. And I approach like the music I'm writing and the like the campaign book in the same way. Like it's this overall massive project, and here are all these things that I'm doing with it, and it's just me. Like for so far, like, yeah, I've gotten feedback that's been super helpful, and I'm going to credit like everybody by name in that book. But in terms of making content for the book, it's just been me, with both the artwork and with the mechanics and with the layout and with the theme, and doing all of it myself. And so it's not to say that like, oh, I'm better or something because of that. It's a lot of work. There are times I wish I had somebody kind of working with me to be like, hey, you can cover this part, I can cover this part. But I just don't know if it would kind of, I would have that fear of like, well, this actually wasn't what I envisioned or something. But that's why I value really good feedback and just people who are supportive of it, because it just makes it feel worth it.
Yeah, and I think it makes total sense that you would end up developing kind of a campaign setting that you can collectively bring all of your brews together under. Because, I mean, a lot of people will either tend to specialize into one particular type of brew they really enjoy. Like you say, there's like people who specialize in classes or monsters or magic items just because that's what speaks to them. But then the other end of the spectrum, you have people who just do everything and like to try and do everything. And it makes total sense to try and pull all that under one umbrella of a campaign setting that you can fuse everything and have it all interact with one another.
Yeah, and there are definitely people who can do a lot of different things, and I really applaud them for trying to branch out and do quite a lot. And then there are people who will do a lot, but they'll also be really, really, really good at making a certain thing. And I'll go to those people for feedback with that stuff. Like, for example, Izzy on the Discord of Many Things is incredibly good, along with Not the Smooths. I think she's also fantastic for like getting feedback on class design, because I've gone to them multiple times with my witch class. In fact, I was speaking with Smooth the other day, and she helped me for 2 hours trying to refine, like, hey, this is the witch class. It's been around for a few months, but I haven't publicly released it yet. Just kind of polishing it up, because there's always something that you can do to improve, right? Like those two are very fantastic. Or like if I want to go to Genuine with Warlocks, or I want to go to Bladebot EU with Barbarians, or a buddy of mine named Rob Nocti for Monsters. There's a guy I know named Flashpoint who's really great with Monks. A guy I know named 80 who's really good with understanding Druid thematics and like ways in which you can approach sorcerers. And there are a lot of people that I look up to, and there are people who focus on like not necessarily like a class design, but like a theme. Like I have a buddy of mine named Pro who's fantastic when you want to do something dream related, like Oniromancy or Dream Worlds or something like that. Or I have there's Bunny Jin who's fantastic with paladins. Like you can go to them with like a paladin concept, and they'll give you some of the most positive feedback I've ever seen. That peep is incredibly positive, and so. I like going to people who have a really good knowledge of like the specific thing that I'm trying to do, or specifically trying to work on, because there are people who've worked with it a lot. Like for me, I've worked with a lot of wizards more than any other class. And I would never say that I'm like a master of it, but it's the class that I do know like very, very well and love giving feedback for it. Clerics, I'm kind of starting to be able to give some feedback for that because I've started to make a lot more of those, and they're kind of odd to brew for. Like structure wise, I find them harder than wizards, but I think that's just a bias because I've been doing them for so long. But yeah, there are people out there who are just fantastic at doing like specific things, and there are people who are like really good generalists. Like they can make like a really good item one day, then they can make a really fantastic like a spell or something like that. And then there are people who do like that content that's not even like a mechanic, but it's just helpful for like a DM or player. Like I don't know how to pronounce this, but like Shepoku, like Czepeku. Like there are two peeps that make battle maps for just tabletop RPGs in general, and they make some of the most beautifully designed battle maps that I've ever seen. And that stuff can be really helpful. So I think recognizing the strengths of somebody and being able to kind of approach them for feedback can be very helpful when you're trying to make something.
Absolutely. And I think like that's one of the things about the Discord of Many Things. Like one of the things is that it's a great place for meeting like other groups of homebrewers, because like you can absolutely post your brews there and get feedback, but it's such a large meeting place that you are going to get hit or miss like feedback when you post your stuff there. I think the main value of it is to meet other people and join into different collectives. Like there must be at least like 5 or 6 different groups that I've been involved in just through meeting and talking to different people, and those smaller niche groups are definitely much more valuable, I'd say, for being able to get feedback and being able to exchange ideas.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I do think that it's important to surround yourself with people who are going to be they might not like your stuff, but if they're at least willing to, give you honest feedback and, give you that positive kind of constructive criticism, I think that that's really good. Because you also have to be careful, though, that you aren't surrounded by people that just will say that everything you do is fantastic, even if it actually isn't. Because that's about as unhelpful as it is when you get like those comments like "this is garbage." They are equal levels of like in terms like to me on the playing field. Like those are both the same kind of feedback. It's when you get those people that say, hey, this is kind of cool, or I like this part. This is something that I think you're doing real, and maybe this part isn't doing that concept as much. What is it that? What's your intention behind it? What are you trying to convey? Like, what's the thing that you want this thing to do? Because then maybe it can be done, and if it can, we could do it in this way. There's a lot that we can be, done with that, in a lot of ways in which like people can give you good, honest feedback. And I think it's important, and it's something that, like I struggle with a lot of mental health stuff. Like I suffer from very bad anxiety. I have been diagnosed with really bad depression. I have a really bad habit of kind of like stress eating, really, really bad. And so there have been times where my emotions have gotten the best of me, and I've like, said some things or done some things that like I don't really wish that I had done, especially within the context of like trying to get feedback or something, there was like a day where I was trying to get feedback on something, and I was just wanting to do it so I can get it done. And the feedback I was getting, kind of provoked me in a certain way. And it wasn't even necessarily that other person. It was just the way I was perceiving it because it was through text. And it made me like lose it. I was like just really mad, really miffed. And it's hard to, make sure that you keep your emotions intact whenever you're trying to provide feedback to somebody. Not only because of how you come off, but how like that person's perceiving it. And it's a struggle, I've been there where I've been kind of on the real angry side of things. There was a time where I was just like really, like it was this year where it was like a while where I was just really ambivalent to really apathetic towards things. If somebody approached me for feedback, I might not get to them right away. And I feel bad about that, but it's, it can be tricky. And I think at the end of the day, the number one thing to remember is that people are just human. They're going through different things. They have different experiences than you. And it's best to just do what you can without kind of like giving them something to make them feel worse about themselves or something.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's another reason for people to be like, not so just instantly dismissive of stuff, because again, you don't know what that person's day is. You don't know what they're going through at the moment. Like, there's no real value in just tossing out like a cuss at someone's work just arbitrarily if you're not gonna, like, you're kind of taking responsibility for your feedback at that point. And if that negatively impacts someone, then you don't have any idea how the kind of repercussions that can cause.
Yeah, and it could, be really detrimental to it, and you might end up like, that's why you have to be careful. And I mean, like, it's tricky because sometimes you might not know how you're coming across, or you might think that you're, intending your feedback to be seen in one way and it comes across as another, or you might just be like one of the best things I've ever seen somebody do is I asked somebody for help one time, and they just said, "Hey, I'm just not in a good mood to give you feedback. If I were to give you feedback right now, it'd probably be really bad and it would make you feel worse, and I would not want to do that." And that like made my respect for that person, which was already pretty high, go even higher, because I was like, that's honestly, like, I'd rather hear that than somebody just kind of cave and just be like, all right, fine, I'll give you feedback. This is what it is.
100%.
And yeah, it was fantastic.
And I think there is also like a certain element of the community which is, I mean, I suppose gatekeeping would be a word for it, but like there's definitely people out there who see things like what was that old website they had for 3.5? I can't remember the exact name, but there used to be a website which was really poorly curated. Like almost no one had any feedback for anyone. Like things were just written and never iterated upon. It was just full of like very unbalanced and poorly made homebrew. This was back in like 3.5 kind of era. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely people who exist now who lived through that and say to themselves, oh, well, I don't want there to be any bad brew, like with the quotation marks. Like, I don't want to have to sift through all this bad stuff to get to the good stuff. And it's like, well, we don't really deal with that these days. Like we have Reddit, they upvotes, push things to the top and push potentially bad stuff to the bottom. Like you're going to have a lot more exposure to stuff and get more one-to-one feedback. Like I don't think that the way that the homebrew world is set up these days requires people to be like policing brew, because it's going to happen so naturally regardless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's I try to live by the mantra of give the feedback that you would want to receive, which is, you know, like a weirder way of saying like treat others like you want to be treated, but like it's
for sure.
Like specifically with like feedback, like I, you know, and you have to be kind of conscious of it, and it's tricky, and it's something I really enjoy, and I've had kind of a very hit and miss, on and off again relationship with the Discord of many things, and I think over the past several months it's gotten to be a much better place, which is not to say that it was like terrible. I did have some strong feelings towards it, but I think with the help of Booze, NASA, and Damien, that place is growing to be a much more accepting and open, like, I guess, forum. I don't know what other word you'd kind of use there to get like feedback and to have people there that are supportive and like to look at what everybody else is doing and stuff like that. And it's really good. And it can be super, super, super helpful.
Yeah, like even just in terms of like not just the people. I mean, obviously the new mods or the new residents are doing a really great job with the place. But also like it's really good to just stoke your creativity. Like they're constantly putting out those new prompts, the writing prompts for you to like have ideas for brews and to come up with things as a community, working together and like pooling information, like getting new artwork up there and being able to share like DM resources. Like, yeah, it's impressive.
Oh yeah, fantastic. And it's I've kind of grown to really like a lot of like alternate ways in which you can do something in a game, or like a lot of DM tools. I really have kind of begun to appreciate those a little bit more than I used to. And that's not to say like I don't find like spells or items or subclasses, you know, like interesting. I will admit I haven't seen a whole lot of homebrew subclasses, like in particular, or like spells that have really excited me in the sense of like, oh, I would want to play that. But it's not to say that those are bad. Like I've seen some really good stuff that's like, yeah, that's, you know, it gets the theme across. It's very well done. It just isn't for me, you know. And I think that that's fine, you know. Like some people write some really, you know, like edgy homebrew, like really dark, almost disturbing stuff, and it's not really my cup of tea. Like the Vara setting I have is dark, but it's not dark for the sake of it. It's just that there's a lot of weird and disturbing stuff that's going on.
It's like it's dark, but it's not grim dark.
yeah, it's not like, oh, everybody will end in, you know, a fiery death and their blood will be coalesced into some cauldron to summon some demon lord. Like it's not like, you know, that. Like I the stuff that's like just edgy for the sake of being edgy, I think is just not interesting to me.
That's Warhammer.
But what a wild concept. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I totally appreciate that. And yeah, I think like there's definitely something out there for everyone. Like the internet's a large enough place that you're gonna eventually come across something, but it's definitely worth putting your campaign setting, your brew. If we didn't, then I mean we wouldn't have the community we do, and it's fantastic that people are taking part and sharing and stoking ideas and like adding it to the greater pool at large, because all that can do is inspire, I think.
Yeah, and it's good to know, like, when you're approaching a concept, like some people will come up with like just incredibly interesting concepts for things, and if they can implement it in a way that makes the most sense, like, all power to them. Like, there are some people that come up with really, really, really cool stuff, and it's also a thing that, like, I don't think anybody should ever approach getting into homebrew like they're going to master it right away, and that they're going to have like the best content ever. Uh, because I don't think that's true, and I think it'll give it kind of like false hope. I think if you can approach it with the sense of, this is something that I can do and learn from, and eventually be able to create, stuff that's a little bit more like, every time you make something new, you improve a little bit. Like, you catch like a wording error, or you understand the balance of a subclass's 6th level budget or some crap like that. Like, you can make it like, just kind of work at it and really start to get like experience and help with it. And a lot of that does have to kind of fall back upon what we talked about with like just the people that you surround yourself with. Can really help. And you just have to be kind of careful with it. You're going to stumble with it, which is something that can be hard to. It could be something that's hard to kind of deal with, like knowing that you're going to make mistakes and that you're going to, not have things that are going to be super well balanced all the time. You're going to have to tweak some things and have to fix some stuff. And it's nice if you ever get to make something and like right out the gate, it's like, actually, this doesn't really need that much tweaking. Like, you can just kind of fix this, and then you're pretty much done. Like, that's cool. And eventually, like, people get to that state. They don't do it all the time. There are people that I know that are way better brewers than I am. And sometimes they'll make something where I look at it and I'm like, I don't get what you're trying to do here. Like, I don't get what thematically you're trying to do, or mechanically. It'll be super confusing, and I won't know what exactly is going on. And I think it's a good thing to keep in mind also, that if you ever get big into homebrew too, to make sure that you kind of stay grounded a little bit too, because don't let things get to your head. Like, one of the things I hate the most about like any kind of like homebrewing thing is like somebody being like so incredibly like confident of their own skill that it like comes off as cocky. Like, oh, I could definitely make something great. Like that, I hate that attitude, because like everybody has room to grow. Everybody can make something that might not be as up to par as like what everybody else would envision of doing. And I've been there. Like, I've made things that like were really well received, and then I've made some things that really weren't. And it's a matter of just making sure to not take things super personally and just build from there and just continue to improve your process. And the only way in which you really do that is by getting good feedback and just by working at it. Like some subclasses, like for example, or spells or items are just going to be tricky to do. But then eventually, if you kind of work at them, you'll have something interesting. And it's an approach that I've had to do a lot with the Yorviing's Guide to Vivara project, because it's a lot of content. It's a lot. And I want to make sure that it's really good and like something that like people would find not only interesting but worthwhile. So it's a lot to that.
For sure. And I think like even within this show itself, like I mean, we kind of follow by the tagline of like accomplished homebrewers, but like I never intend for that title to demean anyone else or like imply that people who end up on the show are somehow better than everyone else. Like I think anyone can become accomplished in the sense that I mean it. And all you really have to do is keep at it, build like a little bit of reputation, and that's justification enough, like for you to be here someday. Like,
yeah, and I mean, like, it's kind of weird being grouped with a lot of the other people that you've interviewed because they are, in my opinion, a lot a lot more well known than I am, and a lot bigger of brewers and stuff, and it's an honor just to be asked to speak in the same kind of series as them. And it's also like over the years, it's also nice getting able to meet people like that. Like I've been able to meet like a lot of the homebrewers that I guess you'd kind of say are like, I don't know, like I guess more well known than others. I think would be the safest way to say that. Like brewers who have kind of grown like a pretty nice reputation for doing certain things or having made this specific type of brew or something like that. And it's fun to kind of talk with them too. Like I'm a very big proponent of just like if you're brewing, and want to get some feedback, just hop on voice with a couple people and get like some vocal feedback. It'll kind of change your perspective of like, at least to me, it did, of how people perceive your brews. Because you might hear them say something that if you were to read it in a text, you wouldn't take the same way. Especially like when you hear, like one of the things that I've heard before that just made me like super happy was when there was a home brewer that I really, really liked who told me that they absolutely loved a brew that I made and that they were going to use it in like a game. And that was the most like, that was a moment where I was like, yes, that made me so incredibly happy to hear that because it was awesome. And I think that that's something that like is really cool to think about. Like when like there are people that actually use your stuff, and if you're, and that's kind of a tricky thing is because unless somebody actively tells you that they're using your stuff, it's hard to know whether or not a lot of your stuff is actually being used. Like it might be liked or upvoted, but it's tricky to be like, oh, this is actually being used. I've been fortunate enough to have people tend to come to me about things like that. Hey, I've been using this, brew for a while. I really like a lot of the stuff in YAG or something. I'm super excited about the Ivara stuff and begun playtesting that. And that's honestly really cool because it's a weird medium of artistic expression, like homebrew, because you don't hear from people actually using your stuff as often as like say you'd hear a musician being like, oh, I listened to your songs, or like the artwork being like, oh, I looked at your stuff. It's tricky like that because like there was a time where I felt like I was just making stuff and it was just like being liked and that was it. And then like there was like a 2-week period where all of a sudden I just randomly got like a bunch of messages on Reddit of people being like, hey, I'm actually using this and this is kind of some feedback I have on it. Like I posted a wizard once and somebody was like, I played a level 14 one shot that lasted like 6 hours, which I was like, that's long. First off, and then they were like, I liked every feature except for this one. It like I feel like it could just be tweaked using this, and that's fantastic. And if you're able to get something like that from somebody playtesting your stuff, then you're in a really good shape, a really good spot.
Absolutely. I think this is probably a good time for us to try out the Homebrew Challenge, if you're up for it.
Yeah, sling it my way, man. I don't guarantee anything super great, but I will do it.
Well, it doesn't have to be the full thing spec'd out. But for those who are not familiar, the Homebrew Challenge, we're going to roll a d20 and challenge Mr. Yorv to try and come up with something on the spot.
Mr. Yorv. Are you actually physically rolling real dice?
I am.
Nice. That's good. I'm gonna roll a d20 with you, and I don't want to use my result, but I'm just gonna do it just because it's been a while since I've rolled physical dice.
Yeah, you got to keep the blood pumping.
Nope. Oh god, 18. That's not that bad.
Oh wow, I rolled a 5.
Not that bad. You got a 5?
So a 5 for me is an armor.
Ooh, homebrewing like a set of armor.
I mean, it can be quite a broad start. So if you need like something to focus your creativity, I'm more than happy to provide like maybe a theme.
I would homebrew. Yeah, give me a theme. Give me a theme, and I'll make something. Because I was almost going to say something that I was almost kind of working on. I feel like that'd be cheating a little bit. So give me something fresh that I can use.
Maybe we could try elemental.
Ooh, I would love to make like a set of armor that focuses around being able to maneuver through and control storms. Like something like would be very useful for like a tempest cleric or like a storm sorcerer, or maybe even a wizard who really focuses on like lightning and thunder. But like maybe it's an armor that has a charge to be able to fly like in stormy conditions. Maybe it's a helmet that allows you to see through like fog and mist and heavy rainfall without like any kind of penalties to your perception.
That's very cool.
And then, of course, gaining some resistance to lightning and thunder, of course, at the bare minimum. But maybe even something that like maybe it's even something that the armor itself counts as like a storm for you for the purposes of like the upgraded effect for like call lightning, where if you cast it in an already existing storm, it increases its power. Like if it like was harnessed, like the pure raw energy of a storm is harnessed within like, I don't know, like some jewel or something in the armor, or it's embedded into the metal itself or the leather or whatever. Like being able to have that count so that you constantly count as a storm for the purposes of doing that. It's very niche, but I think that like some stuff like that would be really cool. Plus, I'm a huge Serranophile, which is like somebody who really, 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 really loves storms. So lightning and thunder and heavy rainfall are something I'm always interested in.
Definitely. That sounds really cool. Like, I want that.
Yeah, somebody make that. And then if you make it, let me know, because I probably will not make that. It's cool. I mean, like, some people make just really, really cool stuff, too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much to be inspired by. And I think, like, it's almost become a characteristic of, like, some of the more prolific brewers, that they all have their, like, signature class. Like, from Ben Huffman's Pugilist to Izzy's, like, Disciple, Sword Meow's Atavist, like, Blake's... Dragon Knight. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm hoping my Witch is going to be really well received, because my... so for full context, I'm Wiccan. That's what I classify myself as in terms of like religious spirituality. And so a lot of my approach to my Witch class was kind of more based on avoiding like certain common tropes and trying to do a little bit more like Wiccan themed things. Like it's not like perfect with that, and I want to stress that it's not like you're going to read this and be like, oh, this is 100% a Wiccan thing. Like you're not going to get it, but it's more like the approach was more that they are a so for context, they are a full caster, they are a known caster, and they use wisdom as their primary spellcasting ability, and they gain their power from dedication to a craft, like a kind of self-ordained, self-realized, that can be influenced by outside sources, but it's a personal approach to someone's own spirituality and way in which they view the world and operate within the world, and see the magic and beauty within the world, which is what a lot of
like me and a lot of Wiccans and I know kind of see the world that way, and we each practice, different things, differently. But it's a real individuality based kind of religion, and so I wanted to convey that with my witch class. And I've seen like witch classes before, and I mean some of them do some things really well. I don't think I've ever seen a witch class that was like bad, because like witches are something that's like, it's very easy to think of a specific witch, but it's very difficult to think of like a generic witch unless you're falling specifically on a stereotype, which I really wanted to avoid. Like there are some spells that are kind of obviously made with influence from like stories of witches, like famous, like Baba Yaga, or like the Witch of Endor in the Bible, which is still a cool title to me. The Witch of Endor. And I've made some spells like that, but I'm hoping that along with all the other stuff that I'm making for this project, I'm hoping that's going to be well received. Because, making a class is a real pain. It's a lot of work with it. And so if you can get it, some people are really good at it, like Izzy and Not the Smooths are really fantastic at doing that. And even my buddy Flash has made like, a couple classes. He's making one now called a Conduit that I'm really excited for. I mean, like there's a lot of cool things, that people can make. And it's just, I'm hoping that my stuff is received okay.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Like, hell, I'm sure that we'll hopefully get some good feedback for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming up to about the end now. I suppose it'd be interesting to know, is there like any other stuff that you're working on at the moment that might be coming up in the near future?
I'm mainly going to be working on my main setting guide for Yorviing's Guide to Ivara, which there is a kind of new, relatively small public Discord that you can find the link for in like the main comments on my posts recently on Reddit. And if you're on Reddit and you really want to join or something, you can PM me if the link isn't working, because I know those share links can be really weird sometimes.
I'm happy to put some links in the description as well.
Yeah, and then outside of that, I'm working with a couple of really close homebrewer friends related to, kind of a group that we're going to be putting. We've been kind of working on putting together and hoping to really kind of kick that off next year. 2020 has been a bad year for a lot of people, including me. So next year is going to be like, some interest with it. But outside of Yorviing's Guide to Ivara, I'm going to be kind of just primarily working on that for a while. After that's done, I am most likely going to try to do YAG 2.0, like 100% revamped. Same thematics, but completely different like approach to it. So yeah, if you're interested in a setting that has like living gods and demigods amongst mortals, occult practices being studied in secret, raging wars between empires and places that are against them, and really strange magic and lands that are seen to kind of blend through the flow of time, then I recommend looking at some of the some of the stuff I'm doing.
Absolutely, man. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you spending the time with us. It's been an interesting conversation.
Heck yeah, man. Always going to support you, dude.
Much appreciated, man. Same for you. Hopefully I can try and get you some exposure.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Anytime, dude. Well, have a lovely evening, man. Thank you again.
You too, man. You have a good night.
Thanks again to Yorviing for joining us, and if you like the sound of his work and want to check it out, there are links in the description. Join us next time when we'll be talking to Rain Junkie, the author behind the Dragon Knight and Titan classes, and more than 30 unique subclasses including the Orchard Origin, Arachnid Ascendant, Hunt Master, and the Lingering Shade. Of course, last but not least, thank you for making it to the end. Until the next adventure, stay safe.